Drop into the forest at dusk, the sky bruised into purples and grays, a chill crawling beneath the damp hush of pine needles. He lies on a bed of needles and broken branches, ribs rising with shallow tremors. A single eye flickers open as twilight seeps through overhead boughs. That eye speaks not fear, but defiance. He was left to die here, abandoned under a collapsing canopy. The cold seeps into his bones, each breath a razor in his chest. His mind fights, flashes of heat, sunlit laughter, and then that sharp crack of betrayal as he fell. The forest floor is wet with pine resin, the air heavy with moss, stench, and fading light. A distant owl coos, unnatural calm to his storm. When he opens his eye again, it burns with a silent plea, not for rescue, but for remembrance. Already fatigue flickers across his face. Already hope is slipping. But even in that moment, his gaze remains strangely steady, a story unbroken, even if the body might break. That gaze becomes the promise. The forest witnesses him struggling there, alive in refusal. Then a distant crack of twigs, someone coming. This is where everything begins. He was already fading when he realized the forest had turned survivor's crucible around him. His breaths came in gasps, each inhale tearing at torn muscle and fractured bone. The ground beneath his shoulder was slick with resin and darker fluid. He tasted his own blood against pine. His mind flicked through the campfire night before. Lauder lifting smoke into star-lit sky, his friend's glance over the flames, warm in reflection, then that snap in the dark, the plunge into shadows, and the world tilting. Now there was only pain, and a faint sound, wind whispering among needles, shifting branches, the steady creak of an upright trunk. Somewhere above, the sky was narrowing to twilight's last gasp. He clutched broken ribs, flinching at marrow, deep ache, and pressed focus into the one clear thing, his eye. That eye refused to shut. It burned with memory, with heartbreak, with life. It refused to let the story slip away. Time folded differently in the forest. Minutes were hours. Rain became a drum chorus, droplets cascading through canopy, striking leaves and pooling on his eyelashes. The cold spread into him like frostbite, but somewhere inside, heat kindled, refusal. He pictured warm sunlight on his skin, felt the memory of Lauder tipping close. Pain sharpened then blurred, adrenaline and terror mixing. He fought to blink awake, to hold conscious. The world narrowed to breath, bone rain that defied eye. And then, distant crack, the snap of twig or footstep. He stiffened. Rain whipped harder, lightning flickering distant. The forest became a spectral cathedral soaked in mist. And yet, something answered his silent plea. The crack grew nearer. Light broke as rain softened into scattered drizzle. Lantern glow appeared between trunks, a human shape, silhouetted, hesitant, then rushing. She knelt at his side, lantern beam trembling as she scanned his face and body. Her voice was gentle urgency. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Warm fingers, cool sweat, pressed on his ribs, steadying them. He focused on her eyes, fear and care fighting behind them. She made a splint out of fallen branches in her scarf, spoke softly as she bound him. Every movement made agony bloom, but he breathed through it, clinging. She gathered him in her arms, lifting him slowly, supporting him with steady devotion. The forest around them hummed with night's retreat, distant birds cried. Branches bowed, releasing droplets. Dawn shade seeped through. She carried him on through fog, stitched trails, over roots slick with moss, her hands bruising but confident. At forest edge, dawn spilled golden and paramedics waited. In that threshold, between wild, dark, and human care, he felt his core stir. Alive, the sterile, bright lights of hospital halls felt distant yet necessary. Within, he lay awake in a bed, sheets rumpled, monitors ticking. Every intake of breath was a reminder of fragility. He stared at the ceiling's harsh glow, remembering the forest's depth. His ribs healed slowly beneath bruised skin. Physiotherapy sessions felt like battle. Each step with the walker nodded fear and triumph in his chest. In the mirror one morning he barely recognized himself, sunken cheeks, pain-etched eyes. But over weeks, his cheekbones lifted, his eyes regained color. He wept with frustration when movements failed, then laughed when he could raise his arm again. Visitors, friends, nurses, strangers who'd heard of his story, gave him letters and hope. He started to see something shifting from being broken to being remade. He looked forward to walks, to air on his skin, to stories to share. Every day was incremental becoming. He returned to the woods 6 months later, stepping onto damp moss that still smelled of pine and rain. Sunlight dripped through leaves in golden rivulets. He paused where he had lain, the broken limb now weathered wood. He knelt, trailing fingertips over bark. He breathed slow and deep, absorbing quiet birdsong, wind-stirring canopy. Earth felt solid beneath him. He looked up, scanning branches and sky, memory folding into present. His body no longer trembled at every breeze. He reached for his friend's hand, her warmth grounding him. A gentle breeze rustled off their clasped hands. He closed his eyes, then reopened them to sweep the forest anew, alive, aware, whole in a new way. His gaze held mourning and gratitude, strength and tenderness. The wind carried a pine, sweet whisper. As he stood, he looked upward again, sunlight touching his face. That one clear eye became a prism of all he had passed through. Conflict, rescue, growth, resolution. The story ended where it had begun, beneath trees. But now his eye told every line of it. The final breath of forest air breathed over him. And he walked forward, forever changed. Rain fell like soft percussion on the world, a gentle but persistent sound threading through the pines, as if nature were holding its breath. The forest, once still, now pulsed with movement, beads gathering on leaves, collecting in the folds of bark, sliding down into the earth where he lay crumpled and cold. His body felt like it was sinking into the soil, one breath at a time. He had no concept of time anymore. Minutes. Hours, he was no longer sure. The trees swayed above him, stretching like long arms in prayer, casting shadows across his muddied skin. And still that eye stayed open, flickering, blinking, holding on. The pain ebbed and surged in waves, dulling into a kind of numbness before flaring again behind his ribs. He had grown quiet inside, a space between agony and surrender. And in that silence, his mind wandered. Not to how he ended up here. Not yet. But to the smaller things, the way his dog used to whine when he came home, the smell of cinnamon in his mother's kitchen, the cracked leather of the baseball glove he never threw away. Little fragments rose like flares in the fog, and he clung to them with the desperation of a man who feared forgetting. He tried to lift his arm. It didn't move. Instead, the motion brought a flash of heat and darkness blooming in the edges of his vision. So he stilled again, afraid even of his own breath. Rainwater pooled near his ear, then soaked beneath the collar of his torn jacket. Every so often he thought he heard voices, or maybe just the forest playing tricks. He had cried earlier, when he still had the strength, shouted out until his voice rasped raw. But now, only silence came back, not even an echo. The forest had swallowed him whole. In that aching quiet, the betrayal began to seep in. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first. When the others walked off, for firewood, they said, he thought nothing of it. When time passed and they didn't return, he thought they had lost their way. But the sun had dipped, and his body had broken, and he'd started to understand. They weren't coming back. Not out of fear, not out of failure, but choice. Somewhere between the laughter and the argument, something had fractured. Something inside them had decided he didn't matter anymore. Maybe they hadn't meant for him to fall. Maybe they had. But they'd left him, and that truth lodged deeper than any wound. The rain thickened, the sky now a low, wet ceiling. A branch snapped nearby, not a dream this time. Real, sharp. He stiffened. Was it an animal? He could feel his heart struggling to race. His pulse pounded weakly beneath the cold surface of his skin. He tilted his head slightly, pain lancing down his side. For a moment, he considered closing his eye. Just for a while, just to rest, but fear clenched his jaw shut. He'd seen stories of people who closed their eyes and never woke up again. Not here, yet. Lightning flared far in the distance, a soft white blossom behind the trees. Thunder followed, deep and deliberate. Then again, another snap, closer. This time, a voice faint, female, calling out. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone sliced through the fog in his mind. Urgent, searching, his lips parted, nothing came out. He tried again. A strangled sound, half breath, half groan. The footsteps quickened. He turned his face slightly, weakly, as the underbrush parted. Lantern light spilled across the darkness, warm and golden and trembling in her hand. Her boots crunched over twigs as she ran to him. She knelt, breath catching in her throat. Her face was pale, eyes wide, mouth already moving. But he couldn't make out the words. Just the rhythm of her voice, fast and soft, like a prayer laced with panic. Her fingers hovered above his body, unsure where to begin. He tried to smile. It didn't come. Then her hands touched him, firm, real human. One hand pressed against his pulse, the other reaching into her coat for something. Bandages. A scarf. He barely registered it. The warmth of her palms burned against his frozen skin. She was speaking again. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Over and over. He didn't believe her. Not yet. But her voice wrapped around him, anchoring him to the moment, the way a lullaby anchors a frightened child. She placed a rolled jacket beneath his head and began checking his limbs. Her brow furrowed when her fingers brushed the wrong spot. He flinched, and she apologized, voice cracking. She wasn't just here. She was staying. That was the moment something shifted. In the haze of his pain, something inside unclenched. He let go. Not of life, but of the fear that had gripped him so completely. He closed his eyes, this time not in defeat but in trust. He was no longer alone. The rain slowed to a whisper. Trees dripped steadily around them. The lantern's golden circle glowed softly, painting them both in amber hues. She held his hand, squeezing once, twice, and he squeezed back. A faint flicker of strength, but enough to make her sob once, quietly, in relief. In the distance, sirens began to wail through the hills. The world, long gone, was coming back. He would return to it. But for now, beneath trees that had nearly become his grave, he simply listened to the sound of her breathing and let it keep him alive. She whispered again, "I found you." And for the first time in forever, he believed it. The night broke slowly, not with the drama of a sunrise, but with the quiet exhale of a world holding its breath too long. Pale blue seeped through the canopy in thin threads, dusting the tips of the trees with something close to mercy. Her lantern had grown dim, battery flickering its last as she crouched beside him, whispering encouragement into the stillness. The rain had finally stopped. Fog clung low and thick around the forest floor, like it, too, didn't know how to leave him behind. She had done what she could, bound his ribs with strips of fabric torn from her own shirt, steadied his neck with a crooked, shaking brace made from fallen bark and a padded water bottle. Her coat, soaked and heavy, now blanketed him. It smelled like lavender and smoke and a life outside the woods. He drifted in and out of awareness, but every time the dark reached to take him, her voice pulled him back. Sometimes she didn't speak words, just soft hums, syllables with no meaning, but full of intention. She held his hand with both of hers, resting her forehead against it when the tremors in his body grew worse. She was shaking too, though she tried to hide it. The fear in her never showed in her voice. It showed in her breath, ragged at the edges, and in her hands, which would pause too long when touching each wound, as if silently pleading with them to not be as deep as they were. "I'm here," she whispered again, though his eyes had closed. "You're not dying here." But part of him still didn't believe her. Part of him was already somewhere far away, where time didn't matter and neither did pain. She adjusted his head gently and stood scanning the woods. The forest felt endwards, the trail she'd come down already swallowed by fog. Her radio had shorted out, her phone battery gone. But she hadn't come for him empty-handed, just nearly. She paced in circles, thinking, fighting rising panic. Her boots sank in wet moss, each step a prayer. She looked down at his still body, and for a moment, just a breath, she feared she was too late. Then he shifted, just barely. A flicker of breath, a tightening at the corners of his mouth, the barest squeeze of her hand. "No," she breathed, rushing back to him. "Not yet. Not now." Then salvation. A flash of movement between trees, a red jacket. Another figure cutting through fog, calling her name. She stood and screamed, waving both arms. The other rescuer, a man with a beard and a bright headlamp, ran forward. The light cut through the woods like a lifeline. They radioed for evac. Coordinates were dropped. Paramedics were still miles out, but moving. She sat again, cradling his head, rocking slightly. The man beside her whispered his own encouragement, but it was her voice he followed. Her voice that kept him from slipping under. When the stretcher came, carried by soaked medics with muddy boots and tired eyes, it was as if the forest sighed. The fog receded just enough to make space. They lifted him gently, he groaned once, and strapped him in, oxygen mask sliding over his face. He blinked, fluttered, and found her again through the blur. His eye, the one that never stopped watching, locked onto hers. She smiled then. Soft, pained, but real. A promise. And he tried to smile back. He didn't remember the full ride out. Only flashes pine, branches overhead giving way to sky, wheels jostling over root and rock. The smell of antiseptic and gauze, warm hands pressing down on his shoulder. Her hand never left his until they reached the edge of the forest, where civilization blinked to life in the form of ambulance lights and gravel roads. Then the medics took over. Voices rose. Doors swung open. And for the first time in days, he saw the open sky, gray and wide and full of light. The cold that had held him for so long seemed to lift. He breathed deeper than he had since before the fall. It hurt. It meant he was alive. Before they closed the doors, she leaned in. Her hand touched his forehead. "You held on?" she whispered. "I knew you would." His fingers twitched, just enough to brush hers. He wanted to say something. He didn't have to. Her eyes were glassy as she stepped back. The forest behind her was already folding in on itself again, shadows returning to the hollow she had carved through it. But in that last shared look, there was no darkness, only light, only the story they now shared. As the ambulance sped away, he let go of the forest, of the fear, of the pain that had defined him in those endless, wet hours. He closed his eyes, this time knowing he would open them again. The antiseptic light of the hospital room felt like a different planet. The sterile air, humming vents, and slow beeping monitors belonged to a world far removed from the damp, pulsing stillness of the forest. He woke beneath a ceiling that didn't shift with wind, under blankets that smelled of bleach instead of pine. Tubes ran into his arms, gauze wrapped his ribs. He blinked hard, tasting the stale dryness of oxygen tubing and hospital linen, and for a long moment he didn't know where he was. Only that he was not where he had been. Then it all came rushing back. Not in words, but in weight, the sharp bite of cold rain on his spine, the ache in his chest, the face of the woman who had found him. Her voice, the trembling warmth of her hand on his. He tried to sit up, and pain bloomed through his side like fire. He gasped, teeth clenched, tears welling instantly. A nurse entered just then, calming him, gently adjusting the bed's incline with practiced compassion. "You're lucky," she said softly, checking his chart. "You were close, but you're here now." He nodded faintly, too dazed to speak. In the sterile quiet, the world had slowed again, but not like the forest. This time, it wasn't silence that haunted him. It was the sudden absence of fear. Pain became the new landscape. Every breath was monitored. Every movement required help. His left arm had been dislocated, his ribs cracked in multiple places. Deep bruising marked his back like the forest had tried to keep him as its own. But what shocked him most was the weakness. His muscles had gone soft, strength stripped by shock, exposure, and trauma. The doctors said he'd fought hard. The body remembered survival as war, and he'd waged it silently for hours. Now came the rebuilding. The first time he stood was 3 days later. 2 nurses and a walker. He shook before he even left the bed. His feet touched cold tile and the whole room spun like storm clouds. Sweat poured from him within seconds. He sat back down, ashamed of his own body. Recovery, they said, would not be linear. But they didn't tell him how much it would hurt to look in the mirror. The man staring back was not the one who had hiked into the forest. His face was sunken, his beard patchy. There were bruises deep beneath the skin, like old regrets surfacing. He barely recognized the eyes, except for one thing, that gaze. It was still there, still watching, still telling the story. Visitors trickled in, one friend, then another. Some sat in silence, unsure what to say. Others filled the space with jokes, trying to outrun the weight of what happened. But the most unexpected thing was a letter. Handwritten, folded into a plain white envelope, slipped in by a nurse. No return address. It was from her. She had found him in the woods, stayed with him, saved him, and then, quietly, left before the cameras and the questions came. She hadn't stayed for praise. She'd done what she could, then faded like mist after rain. Her letter was short. "I don't know if you'll even remember me, but I remember you. The way your eyes refused to give in. You kept breathing when everything else said stop. I just helped you finish what you'd already started. Don't let anyone forget what that took. You're not broken. You're proof." He read it twice, then once more, then folded it and pressed it to his chest, careful of the bruises. Her words became a mantra. "You're not broken." They echoed during the worst of it. The weeks of physical therapy, when his body rebelled and screamed against every stretch. When he collapsed trying to walk across the room. When nurses had to lift him, gently, with apology in their hands. He would see her letter on his nightstand. and it would give him the strength to try again. There were setbacks. Nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding from dreams where the forest swallowed him whole again. Days when the news ran his story, painting him as victim or miracle depending on the headline, and it made his skin crawl. He didn't want to be either. He wanted to be human again, so he worked. Slowly, painfully, earnestly, he relearned how to trust his limbs, how to take up space again, how to walk in a body that had been pushed to its brink and come back softer, but not weaker. One morning, nearly 4 months later, he walked unassisted to the hospital garden. The air outside hit like a memory, crisp, real, filled with earth and leaf and something unnameable. He stood by a bench, hand gripping the back for balance, and he wept, not from sadness, not from joy, but from being here. A nurse caught him. She didn't interrupt. She just placed a hand on his shoulder, then walked on. That evening, he looked in the mirror again. The bruises had faded. The beard was trimmed. His eyes had softened, but they hadn't dulled. They still burned with story. He reached for the letter again. This time, he didn't read it. He just held it, then folded it back into the envelope and tucked it into his wallet. He was almost ready. The path back to the forest wasn't paved. Not with stone, not with signs, not even with certainty. It began somewhere in the quiet, in the spaces between appointments, in the silences after therapy, in the long walks taken not for exercise but for remembrance. He could feel it long before he saw it, that pull. Not of vengeance, not even of closure, just completion. A circle waiting to be closed. It was late spring when he returned. The forest was no longer heavy with fog or winter's claw. It breathed, alive with birdsong, with sap sticky branches reaching up toward an honest sky. The sun filtered the canopy in dapples of gold and green, warm and uneven, like light learning how to touch again. He parked far from the trailhead and walked in slow, steady steps. The underbrush crackled underfoot, his left knee twinned, but he moved with intention. He carried nothing but a small notebook in his back pocket and her letter folded tight against his chest. The forest didn't feel cruel now. It felt sacred. Every turn of the trail was a memory, a moment of breathlessness, a vision of her lantern glowing like a flame inside a snow globe. He kept his eyes forward, but his body remembered it all, the slip, the fall, the waiting, the watching, but the sound, not just of her voice, but of his own heartbeat finding its rhythm again. And then, there it was, a clearing that wasn't a clearing, not really, just a space where the trees pulled back enough to let in the sky, and the earth dipped slightly like a cradle. The place where he had almost ended, where he had been left and yet, somehow, not lost. The branch that broke his fall still lay there, now dry and stripped of its bark by wind and time. Moss had crept in, curling around its edges like a bandage on old bone. He moved slowly, lowering himself to one knee, then sitting on the soft, damp ground. For a long while, he just breathed. He could hear everything now. Wind through firs, a distant hawk's cry, the slow hum of life moving on. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the notebook, opened it to the first page, then paused. What was there to say? He stared at the blank sheet for long minutes, the pen hovering. He could have written about the betrayal, the leaving, the friends who never came back, whose names he no longer spoke. But that wasn't the story this place needed. He could have written about the pain, the fever dreams, the hallucinations, the awful stillness of knowing your body is too broken to call for help. But the forest already knew that part. He could have written about her. Instead, he wrote this: I didn't die here, but a part of me did. The part that thought I had to be alone. The part that believed pain meant weakness. The part that thought survival was the end of the story. It's not. This moment, this forest, this breath is the beginning. I'm not here to remember what happened. I'm here to forgive it. He signed his name. Then he folded the page, tore it carefully from the spine, and placed it beneath the branch that had once held his broken weight. He sat back and looked up. The trees swayed softly, a rhythm older than language. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and listened. A breeze stirred the edges of his coat. A bird landed nearby, quick, curious. The world did not mourn what had happened here. But neither did it forget. He stood again, knees stiff but sure. He walked back slowly, letting the forest surround him but no longer consume him. As he reached the edge of the trail, where sunlight spilled fully onto gravel, a woman stood waiting. Not her, someone else. A new friend, a life built after the breaking. Her presence wasn't rescue, it was a choice. She smiled gently, without asking if he was okay. Some people don't need to ask, they just know when the past is being left behind. He took her hand. It was warm, real, unshakable. They walked together in silence toward the car. He glanced back only once. The light had changed behind them, brighter now, soft golden streaks through the green. His gaze held there. Steady, grateful, alive. And as they reached the road, as the forest fell away behind them, his eyes closed for just a breath, then opened again, the way a book might, the way a heart might, the way a man might when he finally understands that survival isn't the end. It's the beginning of how you tell the story. And his story would always start with an eye that never closed, and end with one that finally saw. The last time he'd stood at the edge of the forest, he'd been broken. In body, in trust, in something deeper he hadn't yet learned to name. This time, the ground beneath his boots felt steady. The trees no longer loomed. They stood tall, yes, but no longer like prison bars, more like old witnesses. Quiet, watching. He looked over his shoulder once at the trailhead fading behind him. It didn't pull him back. It didn't threaten to swallow him. It just was part of the story, not the end of it. The woman at his side, the one who hadn't saved him, but who had helped him stay saved, reached for his hand. Her fingers laced through his, wordlessly. They had met in the quiet aftermath. In a grief support group neither of them wanted to attend. She didn't ask about the forest. He didn't ask what loss had carved out her silence. They'd learn each other in pauses. And in time, they'd learn to trust again. He still carried her letter. Not this woman's, the woman. The one who found him. Who knelt in mud beside his fractured body and told him, without knowing him, that he mattered. He had searched for her, of course. Everyone did, after the story went public. The hiker who had saved a man no one else looked for. But she didn't want to be found. She had left no name, no statement. Just that letter, signed only with her first initial. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she wasn't meant to be chased down like a headline. Maybe she was only ever meant to be believed. His recovery had been long. Not just the physical. The muscles would heal, eventually, but the deeper wounds. The ones that had come when the people he trusted the most left him behind. That kind of wound doesn't bleed. It echoes. There were nights he still woke with the smell of wet bark in his nose. Still jolted at the snap of a branch. Still heard the sound of their laughter fading through the trees. But those nights came less and less. They'd become something else, reminders. Proof that he had once been lost and had chosen not to stay that way. Now, he taught survival skills to teens, quiet kids, lost kids. He didn't tell them what happened to him. Not at first. He let them learn through the friction of starting fires and the patience of bidding shelter from nothing but sticks and time. And when they failed, and they always did, at first, he reminded them, you don't lose by falling. You lose by deciding not to rise. He still wore the scar on his left wrist where a branch had cut deep during the fall. Sometimes he'd run his fingers over it absent-mindedly when he was thinking. He used to hate it now. It was a kind of punctuation, a reminder of the sentence that didn't end the way he thought it would. They reached the car and he opened the door for her. She smiled. No words. Just that quiet, steady kind of love. The kind that doesn't rush in with noise but stays, even when the road is long. Before getting in, he took one last look at the forest. The sun had dipped just low enough to cast the light in amber streaks across the treetops. For a moment, he could almost see it again, the flicker of a lantern, the kneeling figure, the warm breath of someone telling him he was still here, still fighting. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the letter. He'd thought about leaving it in the forest that day. But he hadn't. He'd kept it. Not because he needed saving anymore, but because sometimes the memory of a voice in the dark is what carries us through the light. He slid the letter back into his coat, nodded once, and climbed in. They drove away slow, no music. Just the hum of the engine, the softness of the road beneath them, the trees fading in the rearview mirror. He didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. Because now he understood. The story didn't live back there anymore. It lived in his breath, in his steps, in the quiet miracle of the fact that he was still here, And for the first time in a long time, the voice inside him didn't whisper, "Survive." It whispered, "Live."